Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jonathan Fisher. With so many developments in technology, we've been having an ongoing conversation here on the Evolve Sales Leader about what it all means. How do technologies such as AI affect business development and sales? And what are the most successful ways we can leverage these trends? Well, our guest today, Matt Green, knows a lot about growing B2B startups. With a deep background in venture capital, both as investor and as advisor, Matt's taken the role of interim CRO for multiple portfolio companies over the years, and he's got a unique insight into what it takes to grow this and structure the sales and operations for hyper growth. Today, Matt is also helping to run Sales Assembly, a platform for scaling B2B tech companies. And from all that insight, Matt's going to share with us today how to leverage selling in person to gain an edge in this post COVID artificial intelligence driven world. Matt, great to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for this.
I am too. It's a hot topic, and it's one we haven't even begun to grapple with. So many changes in such a short period of time. We're excited about that. Before we jump in, maybe you could share with us how you came by the insights you're going to share with the listener.
Sure. So, as a CRO of Sales Assembly, a little bit of context there. We're a skill development platform for, as of right now, a couple hundred B2B software technology companies. So, we provide all of the day to day skill development and training that their sales and post sales teams need. And in doing this, we, as you can imagine, working with hundreds of B2B technology companies, thousands of individuals within those B2B technology companies, we tend to have a pretty good bird's eye view of what's working, what's not working across this large sample size of tech companies right now, and have some pretty good insight into some of the challenges that they're facing and how they're working through those challenges day to day.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a really unique experience, and it sounds like it'd be a lot of fun. You get a wide variety of different formats. I'm sure there's some commonalities here. Um, well, we're talking about grappling with AI and other technologies and gaining a human edge. Um, as you're out there interacting with all these companies, where are they missing the mark? Where are there some like maybe irrational fears, or where are they missing opportunities to benefit from these technologies?
Yeah, I think the where some companies are missing the mark, so to speak, is they are thinking about AI and how to leverage AI in a relatively binary fashion, right? It's like either is or is not. It either is going to replace outbound sales teams or it is not. Whereas, just like a lot of other things in life, at least from my perspective, the reality, the end result is going to be one of those shades of gray in the middle. So I do think that number one, a lot of leaders and a lot of teams are getting a little bit too nervous around the impact that AI is going to have on the future of sales organizations, but also on the other end of the spectrum, sales leaders especially aren't investing enough or aren't mindful enough about, okay, the return to in-person meetings now that the pandemic is behind us, making sure that their sales teams are equipped with the skills, the competencies, and the confidence that they need in order to interact in person with buyers and potential buyers.
Well, and you do hear this question, is AI going to replace salespeople? I can anticipate what your answer might be, but what are your thoughts on that? That's probably not a binary thing either, is it?
Yeah, I certainly hope not. Yeah, I don't believe that AI is going to replace salespeople, although you have a lot of people that are much smarter than myself, and that's a very low bar to be clear, that disagree with me. But my viewpoint on this is like a lot of other impacts that AI has had on our day to day lives. It's going to be an augmentation of some of the things that we already do. So hopefully, we're going to be able to harness the power and make our jobs as salespeople and sales leaders more efficient, right? More efficient outreach, more efficient coaching methods, more efficient scaling, whatever the case may be, and less about, okay, we're going to completely replace this or that component of the sales organization in a fully automated fashion.
Yeah, I think that makes a world of sense. Brief production break, Matt. I'm getting a note from my co-producer here that there is a little bit of a scratching sound on your audio. Would you be able to click on the settings and possibly look at how to sweeten that up? It could be that there's a noise suppression that either is on or is not on. So whatever it is, let's do the opposite. See if that maybe fixes it.
Great call. I just turned off the noise and the echo suppression, so hopefully that sounds a little bit better.
Okay, yeah, he'll be letting me know. Well, while we're on a little production break, a reminder to our live audience: take full advantage and start posting your questions now. We are going to have Ask Me Anything time with Matt after our main conversation. Post them here now, and we'll circle back at the end of our show. Okay, the word's in. That fixed it. Great.
Beautiful.
Yay us. So what I'm hearing, Matt, is we kind of need a balanced approach. We kind of need to not get over emotional, which is always a great rule in business, anyhow, right? And take a look and see how can we have sort of a right hand and left hand approach. Yes, this does pose the opportunity for change. Some of that may actually even be a bit of a threat to the way we've been doing business. What would you say are some ways that new technologies would, in fact, say this has to change, in specifically in marketing and sales, of course?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think one thing that you mentioned there is important to hone in on just this concept of change. We as humans, we tend to be pretty resistant to change, but when you think back all throughout time, the price of progress does involve the pain of change, right? Most of the time. So hopefully once we get through this transitionary period that we are right now, especially with the recent onset, AI becoming a really big deal, especially with the launch of ChatGPT, we're going to be able to look back and see how much more efficient we've been able to become as at least as sales organizations. But I think really to answer your question in short, number one, I think that leaders need to realize if they haven't already that with the rise of AI powered tools, anything that is ChatGPT related, the space has become extremely noisy, right? And what I mean by that is that essentially any type of sales organization before that maybe didn't have headcount, they didn't have a dedicated SDR team, now they do, right? Or at least the equivalent of thereof, because it's extremely easy for any individual, just one individual, to leverage a platform like ChatGPT, put together a whole lot of, maybe halfway decent outreach messaging and start blasting that outreach messaging to hundreds, if not thousands, of prospects, right? So I think the biggest struggle for leaders right now is being able to find ways to separate themselves to cut through the noise, so to speak. If we know that our prospective buyers are getting hit up every which way from Sunday, right? Especially now because the ability to leverage AI has made sales teams so much more efficient. How do we make sure that we're balancing that efficiency with effectiveness, right? So how do we make sure that we're really drilling in on messaging that is not completely automated, but is much more personalized, right? And cuts through the pack. But how do we make sure that we're doing that in a scalable manner? And again, how do we make sure that we're finding a way to transition ourselves as salespeople to getting used to doing in-person meetings again, which in a world where any company is easily able to send hundreds, if not thousands, of outbound emails a day, having that face-to-face connection with your potential buyer is going to be one of the biggest differentiators that you can make.
So it sounds like in B2B selling, the role of SDR is alive and well, but perhaps that has evolved. I guess a two-part question. A, is that fair? And B, what are some of the specific ways that the role has evolved? Maybe a three-part question. And are a lot of businesses still behind on that evolution?
Yeah, I do think that that is fair to say. Ways that it has evolved is if you look at the SDR role, at least as of call it 12 to 24 months ago, this some version of the spray and pray type of approach tended to yield relatively positive results, right? And I think that was due to two primary factors. Number one, because there weren't nearly as many sales organizations doing it. And number two, the economic environment was much more favorable pretty much all across the board. But the past couple quarters, as we all have seen, especially in the tech sector, there's been a dramatic shift in how buyers are spending money, or I should say not spending money in many cases right now. So when you pile on just the whole chat GPT phenomenon and sales organizations becoming so much more efficient, when you pile that on top of the economic shift, it's led to this sort of dead zone, right? Where leaders are looking at their SDR teams, are looking at the results falling through the floor, at least compared to 12 to 24 months ago. They're saying like, oh my God, how do we fix this? right? So that transitions into the third point of your question is like, okay, well, what can SDR teams, what can sales teams do now to make sure that they are cutting through that noise? What we've seen a lot of really successful organizations do is, again, pull back from quantity of outreach and really focus on quantity or on quality,
Hmm.
right? Really focus on hyper personalization, spending much more time in doing research and focusing less on again, just blasting as many potential buyers as possible, hoping that 1% or less than 1% will actually respond and agree to a meeting, and being much more intentional in your approach, combining email outreach, social selling, phone calls, and again, driving them to in-person interaction with other folks on their sales teams.
You mean you can't just get a dialer and a big old long list and call and get good results anymore? Shocking.
Unfortunately not. Well, I'm sure some people could, but again, it's probably going to be a very, very, very small minority right now.
Yeah, it seems like the numbers mitigate against that as your only approach. So, talk to us a little bit then about the best ways to organize a true land ARC effort, like you're talking about. For a lot of operators that have been in the business for a minute, it's going to be a transition for them as well. Like if you're a manager, how do you structure your team in this new era where they've got to be on multiple platforms? Realistically, to get decent numbers of return at all, they got to be on LinkedIn. They've got to be able to do usually some sort of posting and activity on that platform, not just messaging. And they've got to be really great on the phone. Are there multiple ways you can structure a team to succeed? What are your recommendations?
There are multiple ways. What we do see a lot of organizations do is trying to transition their sellers now, their account executives, to what they traditionally were, which was just closers, right?
Mm,
BDR and SDR would tee up a meeting and the AE would take it from there.
mm,
What the AEs are being coached to do now is be what is called a full cycle account executive for the most part. I mean,
mm,
it's a little bit different maybe if you're selling directly into the enterprise, but we do see a lot of organizations really focusing on like, okay, how can we start training our AEs to become better prospectors? And that is where this land, sea, and air approach, as you mentioned before, that's where that comes into play. It's giving them the tools that they need to become more effective social sellers, right? As you mentioned, posting on LinkedIn, even if their direct buyers aren't necessarily on LinkedIn, there's a whole lot of data that shows that just by posting on a business focused platform like LinkedIn does yield results, because even if you're not direct buyers on there, someone else from your buyer's company will be. And he or she might take the thought leadership, the best practices, the value that you're adding on that platform and share it internally within their organization, which at that point does reach the buyer, right?
mm,
And has, an impact there. That, and again, as mentioned before, giving the AEs the skills and the training that they need to do something that they've never done before, especially if they're only in their careers maybe 3, 5, 7 years, is again finding opportunities to meet their prospects in person, be it through trade shows, industry events, or at least surrounding those types of opportunities. Again, making sure that the account executives do have the confidence and the competency to meet people in person, which I know this might sound weird to us, but if you started your sales career in 2018, 2019 as a BDR and SDR, you got promoted into an account executive, let's say in 2020, for the past 3 years of your sales career, you've just been operating on Zoom like this in 30-minute Zoom increments. So the skills, the soft skills that come along with being able to host a dinner, host a happy hour, meet a room full of prospective clients in person, a lot of sellers haven't had that direct experience before. So as weird as this might or might sound to old fogies like you and I that have done that kind of stuff in the past, it's really nerve wracking for a lot of salespeople to try to make this transition, because again, it's a muscle memory that they haven't even built.
mm. And I really resonate with what you're saying. I deal with a lot of younger people in business, and they're smart and they're talented and willing, but there is a skill deficit. And for those of us who are adept at these social interactions, you don't think of those as skills,
Yes.
but they are. And the good news is that's something that can be trained. Um, that sounds like an awkward thing to try to train on in business. So, what do you recommend on that front?
Yeah, well, it sounds like, again, you mentioned before that it sounds like something that might not be part of the muscle memory, but one of the things that we did here at Sales Assembly back in November 2021, so just as COVID was subsiding and vaccines began rolling out, we started hosting in-person dinners in different cities across the country for VPs of sales and chief revenue officers of companies that we worked with. And these are extremely gregarious, extremely experienced, senior level sales executives, but they haven't had the opportunity to meet in person for the previous year and a half. So it was even awkward for them, right? Seeing them try to work a room, they would walk into a room full of their peers, and under normal circumstances, you'd think that they would just go to town, but outside of, talking about the weather and saying like, okay, well, what brand of vaccine did you get? They kind of ran out of things, to talk about after
Yeah.
that. So it does happen to even folks like you and I. But to answer your question directly, what would I recommend companies start investing in on behalf of their team? Competencies like storytelling is a
Hmm.
big one. Another competency is improv, right?
Hmm.
We see a lot of companies that are focusing more on improv training, just being able to react to different situations on the spot. And also taking the step to actually break down sort of the logistical components that come into meeting a prospective client in person. As weird as this may sound, I heard a story recently where a leader had to coach their account executive because she was on the ground in San Francisco, I believe it was, to go meet a prospective client at their office. And she, was at the hotel. She pulled up the Uber. The meeting was at 10 o'clock in the morning, I believe. She's like, great, the Uber will get me to their office at 9:55, right? And the leader had the coach was like, no, that's way too late, right?
Hmm.
What is traffic going to be like? What is security going to be like at the building? Do you need to check in? Is there going to be a line? So again, as weird as that might sound to people like you and I, for some of these younger sales professionals that have never had to sell in an in-person environment before, they just don't know what they don't know. So it's a big focus on training on those types of logistical competencies as well.
So, do you recommend just some recommend a little malfunction in my mouth?
It balances out the audio malfunction that I had before. So
There
now
you
so
go.
now
Now,
we're even.
even Steven. Yeah, I like it. Well, recommend that could be like
Yeah,
a different variation on that. But
trademarked.
do you recommend sort of some old school, like almost ride along? Then is that a good methodology as well? Take somebody under your wing, mentor them in the real world by doing this. Is that kind of back on the table in light of all
It,
this?
it is. It's a great call out. That's what we see a lot of organizations doing is the leaders actually going out with their teams, leading by doing, being true leaders in a sense. So yes, that is a big focal point right now is doing those types of ride along situations.
So, in terms of leveraging the BDRs in light of these new advances, it's one thing to get them working in multiple formats now. So their role is not just phone based or returning emails, but it's more comprehensive than that. Um, there's a wonderful global workforce that's waiting to help build companies that don't have necessarily the opportunity to fly from where they are to places here in North America. Can that be kind of divvied up as well? Like maybe you have a three-part structure where you have some, the class, that's another classic structure, right? Where they're out there really, really digging things up. Then you have someone who does some pre-qual work, which those could maybe be the AEs. And is that a structure that you see operating out there? Do you recommend that?
Yeah, we see that a lot. And, a great example would be, and there's a company that lives its values, that lives its products, so to speak, that eats its own dog food, a company like Upwork, right? And their whole model, their platform is, folks around freelancers and a distributed workforce. I know that they've had a lot of success with that type of approach, essentially outsourcing some of these repeatable tasks, right? Doing research, pre-qualification, things of that nature, and then having a team of, really well-trained and competent salespeople that are there to sort of pick up the opportunity when and if it makes sense.
We're kind of doing this almost backwards in a way. We're talking about how to do in person selling, but maybe there are those out there who are convinced that we are in a virtual world to stay. Maybe sell the listener on the whole notion that they ought to be looking at in person sales as a way to gain an edge in this era.
Yeah, the easiest way to sell it is right now, in my mind, one of the only things, if not the only thing, that you as a seller are going to be able to do to differentiate yourself from the crowd. Again, regardless of the product that you sell or who you sell it to, chances are, unless you're in a very niche industry, the space itself is extremely crowded, right? Your organization probably has multiple, if not, dozens or hundreds of different competitors that are either selling a solution like yours or a solution that at least looks like yours or claims to do exactly what yours does, right? And if your potential buyers, if you have dozens, if not hundreds of companies that all have now AI powered sales teams that are able to hit your prospective buyers up with, messaging that again, at first glance, reads relatively decently, which some of this AI generated messaging can do. What are you going to be able to do to separate yourself from the noise and impact an actual sale? That's going to revolve around building a true human to human connection. And the best way to do that, in my mind, is always going to be done in person.
Yeah, I do like that. Now, when you are actually are operating on that premise, are we finding that some of our prospects are themselves so habituated to being approached via technology that they're resistant to in-person meetings? If so, how do you overcome that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Not only are some of the potential buyers habituated, as you put it before, but unlike pre-COVID, right, it's not nearly as efficient as it used to be. Where, if you're a salesperson, depending on the industry that you sold into, it's like, okay, well, there's, maybe five or six different major metro markets where I know that there's going to be a good consolidation of prospects that I'm going to be able to sell to. San Francisco, New York, Dallas, Columbus, Ohio, whatever the case may be. Now your potential buyer, the signer on a potential deal that comes from an organization like yours, he or she might live in, Bismarck or,
Hmm.
a suburb outside of Austin, Texas, whatever the case may be. So it's not nearly as efficient to, from an economics perspective, to invest the time and the capital to fly to a city just to host a single individual meeting.
Hmm.
That's another thing that we see a lot of organizations doing right now. If they are investing that capital, when within the sales cycle, does it make sense to do so at the very beginning stages or maybe towards the end stages or perhaps somewhere in the middle? But to answer your question directly, unfortunately, don't really have a good answer to that. Some people, they're either just going to be in a mode where they're not going to accept an in-person meeting. Best thing that you could do there is, again, try to find different trade shows or different industry events that are related to their industry where people from their firm might be participating, people from their company might be participating, and try to build some tangential relationships there.
Would you think that maybe even in your outreach, you could mention that, hey, we're the guys that will come see you in person, and you'll maybe help pull that segment out of your target audience?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that could definitely, as long as you're willing to actually follow through on that, should the opportunity arise, I do think that that'd be a great value add. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, headline a big differentiator between you and other competitors in the space.
So, what are some case studies you've seen? So, you worked with a lot of companies. That sounds like a really interesting angle on B2B selling that you had working with venture and portfolio based operations out there. What are some case studies you've seen where folks have been able to make this transition? Obviously, it's still fairly early, but are you starting to see that this thing's got some legs? This going personal thing is giving an edge to companies in the crowded space.
Yeah, a case study very close to home would be us here at Sales Assembly. We like to think that we've been doing well in this transition, not only driving people, encouraging our prospects to meet in person, but being able to have an impact when we actually do so. But there are a lot of other really great sales organizations that we work with, companies like Clary, companies like Outreach or Gong would be another big one that not only have great brands online and distribute a whole lot of really great and compelling thought leadership and knowledge and best practices online, but have also done really well building in-person events, be they big user conferences where they attract a whole lot of their prospects and buyers, or smaller intimate gatherings, be it dinners or other social events that they're able to leverage to get their buyers in the room as well.
I saw a recent post from, and I think she was the CRO for a fairly prominent SaaS company that if I said the name, everyone would know it. on LinkedIn to the effect that I'm just going to summarize as briefly as I can. Hey, thanks for the efforts to try to schmooze me, but schmooze my people because they're the ones that have to actually decide what they want to use or not. My budget is set. They have some of them have some leeway. So thanks, but reach out to those folks. Like it was very nicely worded. She seems like a nice person. Um, what would you say to that? Has that also shifted? Have we maybe a lot of organizations are a lot flatter than they used to be, which is I think a good thing. Um, would how does that I don't even know if the word schmooze is even a current word anymore, but the idea of spending time getting in person, maybe even a little bit down, not always going straight for that C suite, but maybe looking for some of the folks that are going to be in the middle rung. Does that bear some fruit as well in your experience?
It does, and it's also a lost start. Is rather than going directly to the decision makers, finding different ways to cultivate champions within the organization. And again, the champions are going to be, as this unnamed CRO mentioned, going to be the end user of your product or solution. It's going to be another great avenue to differentiate yourself because what are you going to be able to do? You're going to be able to get a whole lot of advocacy internally, right? So yeah, that's going to be a whole other separate conversation, a whole other podcast that we could possibly have just around the concept of how to build champions, how to manage champions, and how to most effectively leverage them to get in touch with the ultimate decision maker while not ignoring your champion after you do so. Because we see a whole lot of sales professionals make the mistake of once they get to the decision maker, they say, okay, great, thanks, champion, but what have you done for me lately? And that actually ends up impacting the sale in a very negative way.
Yeah, right on. Well, I definitely think that you've planted the seed for your next appearance here on the Evolve Sales Leader. It's been a great conversation already, Matt. I thank you for that. I have no doubt the listener would love to go further with you and your insights. How can they best do that?
Yeah, they could always feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, or you could always learn more about me, my organization, what we do, Sales Assembly, at salesassembly.com.
Okay, very good. And I understand you also have your own podcast that it's launched already, or it's soon to be launched. Tell me once again.
Yeah, recently launched, and our head of marketing would kill me if I didn't plug this. So thank you for the opportunity to save my life here. Yeah, we recently launched our own podcast series, which is called Revenue Jam. It's actually going to be a series of a couple different podcasts where we speak with different B2B software sales leaders across the ecosystem in different formats every month.
Okay, well, awesome. Check it out, Revenue Jam. Well, it's that opportunity that you've got, live audience members, to bring your questions to bear and get some live answers right here. Let's take a look and see what we've got from the group. Um, we got a lot of folks basically. So far, I'm seeing a lot of people agreeing that we've got to get that human edge back involved in it. People wonder if AI is actually sentient. So let's throw that out there as one of these questions. So Michael brings it up. He's got the opinion that it's not sentient like us. It's a little bit ancillary, but obviously related. What are your thoughts on that front?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, I'm not a data scientist. I'm not going to be extremely qualified to speak on this, but I think, as it exists right now, I think the analogy of the printing press, I think is extremely apt, right? Because again, what is it doing at the end of the day, whether it is us being able to talk into our phone and get directions to wherever we're going for dinner, or put together a halfway decent outbound email. It's just about convenience and automation, right? It's
Hmm.
just about making those day-to-day mundane tasks that we do, much like the printing press, much more scalable, right? So
Yeah.
that is exactly how I see it right now, and it's probably what it's going to be like for the foreseeable future.
So, and this is something that this other gentleman and I usually am game to give it a swing, but I'm sorry, sir, Mr. August. Okay, it looks like a cool name. Uh, so, in-person sales remains essential even with the introduction of AI, and that human touch and personal interaction are valuable. So, I'm actually going to add my question to this comment. There are those who even proffer that yeah, I can be trained to have an uncannily human-like persona in messaging. Um, is there as much promise in that as there is peril? Do you think, Matt? Like, what are your thoughts on that front?
I think that It's an interesting question. I would agree that there. I would agree with you, or at least the way that I read your response, that there is going to be a good amount of when you take a look at the balance of promise versus peril, much more promise
Mm,
than potential downside. But again, it is important to realize that, especially when we look at the value or when we evaluate the impact that AI has had on sales organizations. Sure, AI has been involved in some way, shape, or form through platforms like Outreach and Lavender and things of that nature. But this big wave, especially with ChatGPT, relatively new, right? So we are still going through this transitionary period where we're seeing like, okay, how is this all going to settle out in the end?
yeah, there's a lot that remains to be seen as part of this. Part of the thing is none of us can know until we get there, right?
Yeah,
We're kind of we're all in the rocket ship and we're in flight,
yeah.
so we'll find out. Um, so here's a great question from Levy. So how can SDRs best use AI in outreach?
Yeah, I think that the best way to leverage AI in outreach is leveraging it to do research, right? Let's take, for example, if you are selling into publicly traded companies. One of the big misses that a lot of sales folks traditionally have made, or one of the big mistakes that I should say, is not taking advantage of all the publicly available information, right? If you're a publicly traded company, I mean, you file quarterly reports, you have earnings calls, all that good stuff. And what is held within all this information that they're putting out to the public every quarter? It's not only just the financial results, but they talk a lot about the priorities and initiatives internally, right? So how I would encourage, an SDR or salesperson to leverage AI as it relates to, outbound is being more efficient with your research, right? Because you're able to go into a platform like ChatGPT right now and say, pull up the most recent earnings call transcript for XYZ company that you're selling into and identify the top three priorities. Take those priorities that ChatGPT spits out and use that to personalize the email that you're about to send. Make it much more relevant, reference the earnings call that was recently held over the previous couple weeks, and use that as your hook to hopefully get a response.
Yeah, I like that. So here's a good comment from Lindy Hale. She says, "I'm really intrigued by your comment on improv training for sales teams. Can you dive a bit deeper into that?"
Yeah, I think, and this is not necessarily just a new thing. Improv training for sales teams, much like sales professionals joining an organization like Toastmasters to become much more effective public speakers. This is something that we've seen a lot of really successful sales organizations employ going back years. Here in Chicago, we know that the Second City, one of the preeminent improv outlets, if you want to call it that, across the country, they actually have a whole division that's dedicated just to training sales teams again. And when you think about it, improvisational skills really great for doing what? Handling things like objections, right? Someone throws an objection at you, you're going to be able to respond in a much more quick and tactful manner. Or again, being able to entertain people in person through a long conversation, being able to tell stories, to react to stories. That's where the benefit of improv training for sales teams really hits home.
Hmm. Well, not to mention the confidence you gain from that as well. And Lindy alludes to the added utility in terms of team culture. I'm sure that's probably something we could easily agree with, right?
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
That's cool. Here's a question from our company site. So we've got who should be in charge of segmenting and targeting data? Like, should that be a sales manager thing, the individual producers, since there's a lot of technology that can do that? Um, Maybe someone who's dedicated to that task?
Yeah, you do have a lot of frontline sales managers, depending on the size of the organization, that do take the onus of that responsibility. And again, depending on the size and scale of the organization, you could have somebody in a term called revenue operations
Hmm.
that's responsible for sort of identifying and segmenting, the types of prospects that you're going after. It's traditionally not that responsibility of coming up with, okay, who are we going to target, how are we going to target them, is not traditionally held by the salespeople. That directive is usually given down from somebody on high, so to speak.
Well, and I mean, I guess the spirit of the question is probably the overall, increase in democratizing the whole thing. We're freeing our SDRs to post on LinkedIn for crying out loud. I mean,
Yeah.
just a few years ago, no self-respecting corp would have thought of even allowing that until going through 15 channels of approval first, maybe, right? So it's
Yeah.
been a lot of change on that, and there are a lot of tools in some of these platforms where you can just go in. And I mean, even just LinkedIn itself, their sales tools are pretty useful that way.
Yeah.
So, but you're still a champion of having someone who carries that ball. Sounds like
I am. Yes.
cool deal. Um, has that art changed a little bit too? Also, in light of what we were saying earlier about the old saying was it's easier to sell from the top down than it is from the bottom up. I don't think that's necessarily true anymore. It might be true. Even if it is true, it's become so much tougher to get to that top. You still need a way to sell from bottom up. Has that maybe change? Has that changed the art? So we talked a lot about sales on the marketing side of the piece. How has that changed the art of segmenting and targeting an audience for your outreach?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that it reminds me of the conversation that we had about 5-10 minutes ago around building champions, right? The messaging that marketing teams put out there, and sort of the approach is much broader in nature, right? Than it used to be. Whereas before, again, to the point that you made earlier, it's like, hey, how do we get straight in front of the decision maker, right? If we sell a financial solution to CFOs, we want to only target chief financial officers with our messaging. Whereas now, again, because it's harder and harder to get in touch with those people to get their attention, we see a lot of messaging that's being built for folks that are 1 to 2 levels below them, right? The actual end users or people whose jobs are going to benefit from the implementation of whatever tool or service is trying to be sold. And we see a lot of messaging that's being created and dedicated towards them, and a whole lot of value that's being put out there. That's another shift that we see is organizations really coming to terms with the value of just, hey, let's be helpful, right? Let's not try to sell people first. Let's try to be helpful first. And in being helpful, we're hopefully going to build a whole lot of goodwill so that when we do ask for the meeting and start driving for that sale, the prospect is going to be much more inclined to go with us on that journey because we've already provided a whole lot of value to them on the front end.
You mentioned about cutting through the clutter earlier, and man, has that clutter increased, no doubt about it. Are you? And you have a rather whimsical image that we threw up earlier that you've used in your online persona of kind of looking a little bit a little extra personality going on there
Yeah.
that you're projecting through there, which we all enjoyed here on the team. It makes me wonder: are you a fan of humor? Should companies take humor more seriously in their marketing?
Yeah, ironic twist of phrase. Yeah, I believe so. That's an easy answer for me to say yes, but that's just my biases and my personalities come into play. I do think that I think that humor in general, again, regardless of the product that you're selling or who you're selling it to, is always going to be an effective hook. And that is something that we like to think that we built within our brand, so to speak, here at Sales Assembly. If you follow us on a platform like LinkedIn, we do try to be helpful to salespeople and sales professionals across the ecosystem, but we always like to make sure that we're doing it in a relatively, playful and humorous manner, including, taking shots at our coworkers or, even our clients or prospects. Number one, because we're humans, right? And we believe that when you're selling to other humans, it's important to try to connect with them on the human to human level, and humor does a lot towards making that connection. And it's just part of our personal preference, and we do think that it's effective.
Well, anybody who's a fan of the symptoms, as you proudly proclaim in your LinkedIn profile, I would have expected an answer like that from such a guy. So, what I would love to know next, and maybe we can close with this if we don't have other questions from the audience. I'm curious about your background in getting in, becoming an interim uh, chief revenue officer or manager of sales or whatever your role was for a given portfolio company. Um, is that seems like a growing segment as well, to have people that have abilities? This is sort of a side question to the conversation, but I'm intrigued by your background. And I think I'm seeing a trend where there's some seasoned guys and gals who know their stuff, and they don't need to go all in and have some sort of career. They probably have enough banked, but they can bring value to the market. and come in and do that role temporarily and be this, this whole fractional CRO thing. Does that have value? Do you think that's going to pass, or is it growing as a trend?
Yeah, I do think it has value. I do think it's going to continue growing as a trend. And I think it's especially value with really early stage companies that, aren't at a point of scale where they need, a dedicated sales leader. If you have an entrepreneur and he or she and their partners and maybe their very small team does have a bit of traction and they're starting to build a sales organization, and let's say that sales organization also includes the entrepreneur that started the company, a lot of them still find a whole lot of value in just having some semblance of structure in
Mm.
place. Things as fundamental as like, okay, well, what do we do with this thing called a CRM? Right. And,
Yep.
forecasting, how do we do that accurately? And like, okay, pipeline, what is a good pipeline coverage ratio? Again, all those fundamental questions that are sort of secondhand nature for a lot of experienced sales leaders. If you are, especially a tech entrepreneur, and you're an engineer, an industry domain expert that knows the product that you build inside and out, and you could probably sell it, right? Because you're passionate about talking about it and you're the one that built it. When it comes time to actually build a sales organization around that, that's when a lot of entrepreneurs tend to fail because they try to scale themselves, right? They try to hire someone who's like, all right, just do exactly what I do. It doesn't work that way. And that's when you need some, sales infrastructure built within the organization where a fractional CRO would be able to help.
Very cool. Well, once again, Matt, it's been a great conversation. You've added a ton of value to our audience, and I'm grateful to you for that. Thanks for being on the show.
No, thank you again, Jonathan, for having me. This was great.
We'll have you back again sometime, and I think we have our topic is already picked.
Perfect. I look forward to it.
We'll see you then. Well, and to our audience, thanks so much for making the show the success that it's become. Keep on showing up and bring your friends. We're going to be right here the same time, same station next time. And want to give a shout out to our sponsor. We're proudly powered by Overpass. Overpass is a fantastic solution if you are one of those fractional CROs, or perhaps you need to get your company to that next level of funding. You can get a team of SDRs or full cycle sales pros working for you in days rather than the weeks it normally takes. Check it out. It's free to open up your account at overpass.com. Fantastic solution out there. And if you've been enjoying the content on the podcast, go check us out in our previous episodes, wherever you'd like to go get podcasts, the Evolved Sales Leader. That's going to do it for this episode. Thanks for being here, everybody. We'll see you next time. Go take care.